In the last few months online, I've seen Linux start to gain popularity thanks to adoption by a lot of different internet figures. In particular, I think PewDiePie, easily one of the largest YouTube channels. Well, he's one of the largest YouTube channels just in general, but the largest to talk about Linux and free software in particular. And I think it's brought a lot of attention towards Linux, and a lot of people have tried it out for the first time as a result, which is good. And there are a number of reasons why people might want to do this. I think, firstly, is just improved support for older hardware and improved performance just in general. Linux is known for being much more lightweight than Windows, so you have less of an overhead for running programs, and it just helps you squeeze more performance out of the machine that you've got. Another reason is growing frustration with Windows. I think this is this has really been a trend since I can remember. People weren't happy with Windows 8, and since then it's only really gone downhill. I think Windows 11 in particular, with all the extra features that people don't want, all the built-in AI stuff, the dropped support for older hardware, there are a lot of reasons that people want to move away from Windows, where the alternative, which traditionally has been macOS, isn't necessarily much better. Then another reason, which I think PewDiePie leaned into heavily, was customization within your system. There's something really nice about being able to design how your desktop environment looks. It's something that a lot of people who might be more technically minded wish they could do with Windows, or saw the limitations of Windows and thought, I'm going to try that. It might be cool to spend a bit of time customizing, the look and feel of your own system. And then finally, video games are actually a bit of a motivation, which is a weird thing to say, because if I'd said this 10 years ago, there would no chance you were running Windows games very comfortably on a Linux machine, but there's been a lot of work put in by Valve in particular around Steam Proton, and now video games used to be a factor that would hold people back from moving away from Windows. Now it's not so much of a limitation. There are actually very few video games now that don't run on Linux at all, and the ones that do run quite often perform better than they do on Windows. But I think there's a couple of factors that people really overlook here when you first get into Linux, and that's kind of two of the central points and the reasons why the operating system was started in the first place. The first one being that it's Unix-like, and I'm not going to go too into detail on that at the moment, because I think for a complete beginner, it's less important or makes less sense. But the point I want to talk about is that it's free software. And by free, I don't really mean, free of charge, which of course Linux is free of charge. But I mean free as in you have the freedom to do what you like with the software. You can view the source code, you can change it, you can compile it yourself and use it in whatever way you wish. And I think this is actually an extremely important factor in why I use Linux, and I think it should be for you too. And it's really one of the reasons that Linux was started in the first place. So if you don't know who this guy is, this is Linus Torvalds. He's the man who started Linux. It's named after him. And the reason that he started it was because he wanted to tinker with his computer. He wanted to tinker with the operating system on his computer. And you simply can't tinker with proprietary software. If you can't change the source code, how are you meant to change anything? That's just how software works. And at the time, the three kind of major operating systems were Microsoft DOS, Apple macOS, and then Unix was around. Unix was popular for sure, but not on home computers. It was mostly used for servers, mainframes, workstations, etc. No one was really running Unix as a home computer operating system. And so that's why Linux was started. It had the intention of being a Unix-like operating system, but one that you had complete access to because Linus couldn't get access to any of the other operating systems. So he started working on his own. And one of the key principles was that anyone could study the source code, they could modify it, and they could use it in whatever way that they wanted. And this last part is really why I think that Linux is worth using, and why I think free software in general is worth favouring over proprietary software. If you can't read the source code of a program, you don't know what it's making your computer do. The only way to be sure of what a program actually does is to read its instructions. This is something you simply can't do with proprietary software. There's no way you can guarantee what the program's doing. You don't know what Windows is up to. Moreover, if you see that your system's doing something you don't want it to, there's no way you can stop it, unless the developers have built this into the settings. But as you can imagine, a lot of the things that you might want to disable in your software, there's just no option to do it. You can't remove it from that software. On the other hand, with free software, if a package has a feature on it that you don't want, you can simply remove it. And you might be thinking, I'm not a programmer, I wouldn't know how to remove something from a program, and I take that, that's a fair point. It's not trivial by any means, but it is worth noting that if a feature or change is viewed negatively enough by the users, someone will put in the work to rectify it. A good example of this is ungoogled Chromium. So this is a package that's just Google's Chromium browser, but they've stripped out all of the Google dependencies, which is great. You get the core product, which is a good browser by a lot of metrics, but you don't have all the tracking that's in place. You don't have to sign in with Google. There's a lot that's just completely removed, which otherwise you probably wouldn't have wanted anyway. Another good example is Mate, which is a fork of the GNOME 2 desktop environment. This was an older desktop environment in the kind of late 2010s, and GNOME 3 made some significant design changes. This is equivalent to the Windows 7 to Windows 8 change, where a lot of people just did not like how everything was laid out. But instead of abandoning the old GNOME 2 environment, one user just decided, why don't we continue maintaining GNOME 2, give it a different name, and gradually it just evolved into its own package. It became its own thing. If this were possible with Windows, I can only imagine the number of forks that we would see, removing advertisements, removing AI features, rolling back to older versions of the core Windows programs. The reason none of these things are a problem in the free software world is because there's no point implementing them in the first place. No one would accept adding advertisements into your taskbar or into your graphic software. It makes no sense. Only proprietary software can do these malicious things to your system. Even on installation, if you're installing Windows for the first time, Microsoft now forces you to log into a Microsoft account. You need to have a Microsoft account to use the operating system, and this is ridiculous. You don't have to do this with Linux. You don't have to log into any accounts. And in fact, I think if Windows were free, you probably wouldn't even have to move off of the older versions that some people might prefer. People would be able to voluntarily contribute security patches and feature updates to keep, Windows 7, for example, to keep Windows 7 supported. And I think this would absolutely happen if it were possible, given the number of businesses that still rely on older versions of Windows. These are major security issues in most companies that have been around for any length of time. You look, the NHS had major attacks way back because they were running old versions of Windows. These are problems you could solve if other people were able to maintain them, but Microsoft holds the keys to that. So when you're setting up your new Linux system, I would encourage you to give free and open source software a chance. Don't just install Linux and then immediately try to get all the same software that you had on Windows. Think about each package you install and ask yourself, does the usefulness of this software outweigh control over my own machine? In some cases, the answer to that is going to be yes. You might work as a music producer. there's a huge gap in music production software in the free and open source space. There's software there that does it, but it's not close to Pro Tools. It's not going to replace some professional software. I get that. But in some cases, it might be possible. And I think trying's better than not trying. Going 100% free software is obviously a really difficult task, especially if you're just getting into it and don't really know the landscape very well. But I think it's actually very easy to reach, say, 90% free software. If you're already running a Linux distribution, then you're probably most of the way there. And you might only have one or two proprietary programs left that you just can't really replace. But in the grand scheme of things, I think you're in a much better position if the majority of the tools that you use on a daily basis are in your control. So think about it. Most people don't even know how to think about it. Software licensing is a very niche concern, unfortunately. But I don't think that makes it insignificant. So, yeah, have a think about it.